Couple verses for today. Before we get into our study together, if you would take a moment and bow with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings that we share in Christ. We thank you for the joy that is found in the community of Christians that you've surrounded us with. Help us to be good listeners, to be careful readers of your word, and to have a heart that is devoted to you. And all this, we ask our prayer in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, so again, we are in 1 Peter chapter 1. A couple things that will be of note for us is to kind of pay attention, especially since we are emphasizing just two verses for our study this morning. A careful look at verses 1 and 2. They come on the heels, though, of our large introduction to 1 Peter. And our consideration of the entirety of the Christian community that surrounds this particular writing as it's given to these disciples. With that, I want to introduce at least kind of the way in which we can think about the text. In that, there are some themes or some big ideas that are important to us. Number one, big idea, is that believers, followers of God, disciples, are benefited when they understand that they are exiles. The exilic or cast out perspective helps us understand the conflicts that we encounter in life. Secondly, salvation wasn't an accident. It's a planned endeavor. And so even in these first two verses, we can recognize that this is structured, planned, organized in a way for a reconciliation between God and mankind. Thirdly, the covenant that we're part of, it's made possible through the endeavors of Christ. And fourthly, in this particular text, we actually get to see one of the strongest cohesive or all in one small spot illustrations of the way in which the family of God or the Godhead, or if we're going to use kind of classic 7th century arguments, the Trinity is present in the New Testament text together. So let's begin first by reading the passage just briefly as a group. Justin, you want to read that for us if you could? This is in 1 Peter chapter 1 and just verses 1 and 2. 1 Peter 1, 1 to 2. You get the math right there. Yep.
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for the sprinkling of his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you.
All right, so before we go any farther, let's at least emphasize one of the things I think is pretty cool is that in this text you didn't get the Father, the Son, and the Spirit as workers together. You do see them in other sections, particularly in the New Testament, where they're present in the same narrative, where they're present in the same context, like the same setting. And I've said a lot of times, when we read back into Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through the end of the creation narrative, round 1, which doesn't hone specifically into mankind like it does in the second way in which it's retold to us, we see them there, where in that Genesis 1 account, we read in the Son, and we read in what we understand to be the Spirit there. We kind of think about it in that way and say, okay, they're all there. They're there at creation. Well, here they're all present. They're all recognized in that sense. And I think, at least, that's something that we can use to better appreciate and understand that relationship. Because I don't know about you, but that's one of the things that I ponder a lot about deeply, trying to figure out, like, hey, what's going on with this? What does this imply, mean, or kind of connect to in a way that is profitable to the growth of my faith and understanding, more clearly what it is that God needs me to get from the text. Here in the passage, there's really only two key structure points for us to pay attention to. Number one, obviously, the author and the recipients. And two, I would say that the second verse kind of sets the stage for the rest of the letter. It gives us a foundation of facts, if you will, that we're going to use to explain the rest of what Peter will write. And, obvious tidbits. The letter opens up pretty customary way. How many of you remember in school when they taught you how to write a formal letter? You guys remember doing that in school? I know I did that in English classes a lot, where they sat down. This is how you write a formal letter. And what's our common, customary American first thing you write in a letter? Dear something or other, like dear sir, dear friend. Do we often even know who we're writing to when we say dear sir? So what do we mean by that? Do we actually hold them dear to ourselves? Because what does DEAR mean? Not deer, the kind that jump around and kill your cars.
Close relationship.
A close relationship. Like there's a sense of affection. What else? Anything else behind that? I partially think it's a rubber stamp. I think we now have turned a word that used to have some substance to it to like, this has to go here. This is where it goes. And maybe we don't think about what it actually implies. And actually, formal letters, at least business letters now, have shifted some too, because the first thing that goes in the letter is the formal representation of their address and your address. Like you actually have this little box where you put your address, your information, their address. Strong functional letters. When you go back and read the letters of antiquity, particularly those around the first century, this is super common to introduce themselves this way. It's not the only way, but it is a common method of introduction. And it kind of connects us in a personal way to them, because we do much of the same things in our more casual kind of notes and comments to one another, especially if there is some level of relationship that goes in a structure somewhat, where they have to kind of assert who they are. Because Paul does that in his letters, and Peter does that here. He says, in simple terminology, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. What all does that mean then when you think about that first verse? We get to know who it is, but how do we envision all that we know about Peter? Even the name.
Well, I guess even in the simple sense, it's establishing credibility, establishing authority, establishing the relationship that he had with Christ. So those are the three I can think about.
Yeah. Let me ask you, and this is a connected one to it. How many of you, and even just one of you, who's willing to share with us a childhood nickname? Something that was given to you. Michael, you're maybe?
You mean my nickname?
Yeah, your nickname. Something that was given to you that like you're okay with sharing it. And if it's funny, it's better.
Let me just mind sharing until I realize this is broadcast.
And your mom was probably watching.
No, it was Burr, B-U-R-R.
B-U-R-R, all right? So, and we all have little nicknames like that. We get our kids little nicknames like that. And they say something about our past experiences. They usually, you earn that nickname at some point. You were granted it, bequeathed it, bestowed it. And when you use it, especially when someone addresses you by that name. Like if you're both grown, full-grown adults, and somebody writes your childhood nickname to you, all of a sudden, you're tapping into that relationship. Remember, Cephas, Peter, is Simon. And so when he uses a name that was bequeathed to him, bestowed to him by the Lord, He's actually kind of connecting him to this relationship at a slightly different level. And he's known by that now. It's supplanted who he was to a degree to whom he is. Further, if we're going to go shifting to his role, apostle, messenger, we could also give a lot of different roles to Peter too. What other major facets of Peter's life does the Bible account for us? I'll give him a good one. Peter, a water walker of Christ. Peter, that's another one. A traitor, because he ran. Peter, forgiven by Christ. All of those kind of, what's another one? Denier. That's even harder. You know, all of those create the summary that we all kind of keep underneath the water as to who he is. And yet, by inspiration and by the plan of God, he is reintroduced to us here at this point as simply Peter, an apostle of Christ. A lot of folks have a variety of ways they think about Peter's role among the disciples in the first century. There are some who elevate him and try to create he's the chief of the apostles, except there's no actual textual evidence to show him as being the chief of the apostles. There are some who even give him secondary roles that eventually in their minds evolve into the papal structure. But we don't see that either in the New Testament text. I do think, though, many of them are right in recognizing this about this letter. There's a lot of things he could have said, and by inspiration it is simply this. He's just an apostle of Christ. That is both a name that associates authority, but in then it's also enough. There's no need for extra. There's no need for him to go into longer descriptions and discussions. And I think really the most significant fact of this isn't so much just as an apostle right now, but to rethink this whole dialogue he has to get the name, to become known to us as Peter. So think back for that section, if you will. It occurs in Matthew 16. And what's the dialogue there? What's going on that all of a sudden Simon becomes Simon Peter? Yeah, it comes from, this is, again, the Gospel of Matthew, and there's a long dialogue that takes place there in chapter 16.
They're discussing who Jesus is.
Yeah. Who?
Who's Jesus?
Who is this anointed one? Now remember, every time you see the translation of the text, Christ, keep in mind that that's the word that implies or means anointed. It's not a last name. It's a title of a kind. And it is no different, by the way, in the word than the role in which Saul and David had as being God's anointed. Same word is used to describe anointed throughout the Old Testament text for David, for Saul, and then for the coming suffering servant in the prophets. And then when we come into the New Testament, he is God's anointed. So Jesus is God's anointed there. And so we have that and say, well, what is that? Who is that? Who is it? And what does that mean? So ponder for a moment the scope of possibilities when you think about the same question. Who is Jesus? And who is God's anointed? And what then does that mean? If I asked that question of, say, a Pharisee, a scribe, or a lawyer, and I said, who is God's anointed? what was their typical cultural answer to that question? What kind of anointed leader were they looking for? Physical king. And depending on who you asked, they might have inferred, or you might have read their response as, a physical king we can control. Because that seemed to be their biggest concern, is that Jesus was not bowing to their whims. He was not one of them. He was something else. If I ask that question of someone living in the upper Galilean region in advance of the arrival of Jesus, and that's where all the poor people lived. If I say upper Galilee right now, just think, wherever you imagine the poorest people of the land to live in, that's the people you're thinking about. When you said someone who is God's anointed is coming, how would they perceive the anointing of God?
Someone coming from royalty.
Like distant royalty. How many of them really knew any of the kings? No connection whatsoever. I recently saw a friend of mine came across like a trading card for Pele. Pele's a soccer player. If you didn't know who Pele was, arguably the GOAT, the greatest of all time in soccer. The youngsters and hipsters all think that it's young people, but I'm going to agree that Pele is the best of all time. Certainly has the strongest mathematical credentials. Well, in that little card, it included a tiny little portion of a jersey he wore in a game. And he was selling the card. I didn't ask how much it was, mainly because I was afraid I would actually be able to afford the card, because it's probably not worth that much. I don't need to spend money on a trading card. But that's about as close as most folks are ever going to get to anybody who's a star, is owning a piece of their uniform. But to the Galilean regions, this royal individual who was anointed was also predicted to be someone to set them free, to bring them liberty. It says explicitly to set free the captives in the prophet's message, to redeem, to rescue them. So even if he was to be distant from them in their minds, the arrival of the anointed meant we might be lifted up. We might be set free, right? So this callback here in the text of Peter's letter to exiles, to the cast-offs, reminding him that it is the anointed of God who has rescued them, is literally interesting. Like, hey, what's going on here? Because he's supposed to set them free, and yet now they're exiles. He's their king. And Peter introduces himself from this close proximity as being, in essence, the messenger of the anointed. One more, and I think we don't always catch this detail when we're thinking about the various apostles, is each of these apostles, no matter which one we're looking at, the grouping of the 12, the one born out of due season, which is Paul, they are all made in the mold of another individual. Who do the apostles have a template that they're kind of like? Who tells people about the coming Christ on a regular basis before the arrival of the Christ?
John the Baptist.
John the Immerser, John the Baptist, right? And you'll notice in their training how much of their training mimics bits and pieces of John's predictable or predicting type behavior. Don't take anything with stuff with you. Only carry little things. Go out. Go out to where the people are. Don't wait for them to come to you. Go out. And where do we find John? He's out in the wilderness. And the wilderness to us means nobody's there. But the wilderness there has all of... Today it has Bedouin communities kind of permanently established. But in the time of Christ, this is where all the small villages were. They were clumped around the water holes and the ravines And so John was out in the wilderness. The 12 and then the 70 are prepared at different times to go out into the wilderness too. And so there's a nice connection there to kind of see what's going on. Further, let's think about the kind of answer that Peter matures through regarding whom he is. Do you consider Peter particularly steadfast or faithful during the life of Christ? Like when he's up until his crucifixion? We kind of do, but yet is there someone who actually demonstrates more stability than him? Who's present at the cross? Is Peter there? John's there, right? And his mom. That's a dialogue that takes place. Behold thy mother. Peter's nowhere to be found. In fact, he's a denier. In the dialogue in Matthew 16, there is a whole counterplay between whom Peter is now, whom he's going to be, whom God in Christ is. And he's given a term of endearment that is designed to tell us something more. Says, well, yeah, on this little stone, this statement, here's this big rock of information coming, and there's huge interplay there. Well, Peter is in some ways still developing and maturing, but he does become a rock. He becomes in some ways a source of stability and strength for the Christians in Jerusalem. He becomes a servant in many ways among the disciples in other areas, and now he is an encourager to a spectrum of believers who are dispersed and spread across the entirety of a region. This is a large area that's being played out there. The term that's maybe rendered a couple different ways. We're kind of inching through the text here, where it goes to the elect exiles of the dispersion. In the ESV, your translation could have scattered as another way to think about that term. The diaspora takes place here, and this spreads the ethnic community of Jews who are now in some ways mixed spiritually. This creates a conundrum for us that we have to figure out at times, because in the first century, Roman authorities, national authorities, even amongst Judaism, how was Christianity seen? Not how it's interpreted or understood by us, but how did cultures view Christianity in the first century? A lot of them saw it as a cult. What's another term that's used, particularly in the trials of Paul? A sect of, there's one more clause, the Jews, right? They saw Christianity as a section, that's what sect kind of implies, of Judaism that was basically, these are just another bunch of Jews who have kind of factioned off in a corner, and we can treat them all the same. And in their classification, that's not necessarily what the Bible is teaching or what we understand as the relationships to be. You would have an umbrella right here. This is your umbrella. And you would have the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. That community existed around Qumran. That brings us all of the great aspects of Old Testament texts that were found there about 60 years ago outside of Jerusalem. You would have zealots. Those were all Jews to the Roman authorities as well. And now you have the Christians. And there's no difference to the Roman world in the first century to these groups. They get treated the same. In the trials of Christ, they're shown to be the same. And the struggle is Christianity is doing something that Judaism never really embraced. Christianity is becoming full of we would say, multicultural and multi-ethnic population. Because they are beginning to pull in predominantly initially what we call, well, they're bringing in the Gentiles. Gentiles in the first century are everybody that's not Semitic or from the area ethnically of Palestine. And so they start looking different. Skin color, culture, language, all shift. Time goes forward, and we still kind of struggle with some of these things. Because we have to separate in our mind the difference between the ethnicity of the descendants of Abraham, which we call Jews, and the religious practice of those who followed the law that came from Moses, which we also call Jews. Same things, same words, but they are separate concepts that we struggle with. Well, that's important for us to see here because these Jews are scattered everywhere, and included in the scattering are Christians in these same communities. And by the way, this is not a new thing in the New Testament text, because what's Paul's number one behavior early on in his ministry amongst these Gentile cities? What does he go do? Synagogues, like, hey, my name's Paul. You might know me as Saul. You want to talk? If that doesn't work, he finds a place where people are praying. If that doesn't work, he goes into the market, the central space of the community, and tries to do that. Standard Pauline evangelistic model. A, B, C. So that shows us that even prior to this, there are Jewish communities that initially are incredibly ethnic-based, closed communities. And the law actually included that expectation to stay closed. You weren't supposed to be bringing people who were predominantly spiritually different, but that translated into ethnically different too, because they're all of the same peoples, all of the same nations, if you will. Time shifts all of that, and a lot of those lines get blurred a little bit through generations. That's all different, though, than whether or not, and this is the theological side, someone can authentically follow the law. A lot of the law revolves around the temple and the Levitical practices, and both in the time that they are in captivity in Babylon and Assyria, and in the diaspora up till to now as well. They haven't been able to follow any of those actual sacrificial communal laws that would take place. And there's a lot of other aspects to that are, tidbits and interesting. But this area, which is kind of like Turkey, if you're thinking about this region that Peter is writing to, is now receiving this letter. In verse 2, it says, again, one translation reads it, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. How many of you at times, this is my question, another question for us to think about, have struggled with the idea of what it means to be chosen by foreknowledge? You guys ever struggle with that concept in either in teaching someone else about it or understanding how it applies to you? Let me give you a couple ways that I've thought through it. You can reject all of them, or you can accept any of them. They're thought ideas, not like this is explicitly what the text infers or implies. If you were to go to the basketball park, any town, USA, and you're going to pick a basketball team, but before you get there, you're talking with your buddy. You got 2, you're going to run 5. So that means you got to pick up 3 players from whoever's around. How are you going to do that? How are you going to pick your team? If you've never seen any of these guys play them more than 5 minutes, do you kind of know what you think a basketball player looks like, Norris? What does a basketball player look like? I know you know. Tall, right? Norris loves basketball, so I could probably work that one around. Tall, right? Now, not all tall people can play basketball. Do we understand that this is correct? I've seen some folks taller than me that can't do a thing with a wall. And some folks much smaller that got Spud Webb life, who will just wreck you, right? That's one of the factors. So, small, maybe not. Tall, yeah. Now, this is an easy one, but you might be uncomfortable saying it. What's another criteria for a basketball player? Lean. That's getting close. Who can't jump? I can say it. Can you say it? White man can't jump, right? Wait a minute. I've seen white people jump before. You just put a snake in front of us. We just jump really high. Some of us will grab the snake and jump with it. I don't know. That's a different crowd. But here's the thing. We have stereotypes. We have classifications. We have thoughts on what something looks like by our foreknowledge. We have predetermined what a basketball player looks like. Tall, athletic, lean. We hope they can shoot the three. More importantly, if you're coming with two, you hope the other three can defend and pass the rock. Because you assume your two are the best. If you're going with two somewhere, you guys already know how to play, right? So we have already got some foreknowledge there. So foreknowledge, in part, includes you already know what it's going to look like. That's one of the aspects to which foreknowledge by God includes. He's already forecasted the kingdom. He's planned what the kingdom will look like. Further, foreknowledge includes the fact that you have a plan. The word itself is not discriminate in the idea of I have pre-picked every single player on the team. It's that you have already planned to have a team. You've already planned to engage the activity. Trey, when you were planning operations within the Air Force, is there a standard operating procedure for things? Anyone who's been in the military has told me regularly that every plan has a plan to make the plan, or some variation of that. You got rules, you got structure, everything has an organization to it. And anything that doesn't fit the organizational chart gets lopped off. Sorry, we don't do that here. But it's necessary, doesn't matter. It has to fit in the box. Because you've already preordained the plan, you've foreknown what this looks like, and you have that plan. Those two concepts intermingle in the meaning of the words that are used to define and describe this idea of foreordained, predestined. But we struggle on the other end of the table because we use foreordained and predestined in a different way. We use predestined and foreordained on an individual basis. We say, we wonder about am I individually predestined? Now please note, the text never actually says that on the individual level. We struggle with it because we want to either, depending on our mood, be preordained, or we're trying to explain to someone that they were not, but they're welcome. Because that's how we use the words. And I'm not talking even about spiritual things there. I'm talking about how we use the word in common conversation in the 21st century and interact with people who are using those same concepts in the 21st century. We use them in those senses that kind of say, well, you know that God didn't handpick everybody. He's giving you a choice. Because we say things like Jesus and the disciples as whomsoever will. That's everybody. But they go like, well, wait a minute. Didn't God say something about it being narrow? And didn't God say something about being only a few who are chosen? Let me go back to the basketball team analogy one more time. If you and a buddy are going to play basketball out at the park, and you're picking teams, and you get there, and you go, oh wow, Barkley's here. I'm picking Charles Barkley. Oh, Is that Spud Webb? I'm picking up Spud. It doesn't matter who we're playing, because he's still better than me. I sure wish Michael Jordan was here. Because if I'm having a team with Barkley and Spud Webb, I want Jordan too. Who didn't come up to play that day in my imaginary basketball game? Jordan. I might want him on my team all I want, but I can't pick him if he's not there to be picked. That's the concept that is in the reality of the ideas rather than the one that we want to put it in there. We want to be able to take Jordan off of the baseball team and pull him back to the basketball team when he's chosen to play baseball. Like that's how we actually have to interact with this term in the practical sense. And if basketball is not your thing and you have a different thing, I apologize, but that's the way that my brain works through it for our purposes to use this word. And so that's the first half of the clause. That these who have been chosen, and by the way, those are those who showed up, who said, I'm whomsoever. I heard you talking. I paid attention and listened. There's another sense of the text that goes, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus. The Spirit has a role in sanctification, but we have the role of choosing obedience. And if you remember a couple weeks ago in our sermon on Sunday, we talked about the devotion of David's mighty men. And that kind of obedience is what we're kind of aiming for in our development as Christians. This is a sympathetic text in that when we see obedience here in the New Testament, it's that kind of devoted obedience that we're looking to develop in ourselves. And it's that kind of obedience that Peter is writing about. The kind that says, absolutely, I will show up. In fact, I love to be here, and I want to do these things, and I desire to do it. And it's in that same spirit that the text concludes with the picture of being sprinkled with his blood. That these who have heard, who have chosen and been chosen, who are sanctified by the Spirit, who are obedient to Jesus, have then been sprinkled by the blood of Christ. And he concludes this introduction and says, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. And I think in some ways, that's a pretty powerful full picture of Peter introducing both himself and his letter to some people he may never have met before. Because you go back, that's one of the reasons why he identifies himself as an apostle of Christ. Because he hasn't met any of us, and we're still reading his letter. And in this entire region, it was Paul who did the primary work early on in spreading the gospel to the Gentiles. But Peter comes later, and we see him interacting with Gentile Christians at a later point in the New Testament story. So that should allow us to then get into the question and answer phase, even though we already had some in the class itself. What are you guys thinking here? Is stuff you like about this introduction to Peter's letter, questions you have that you haven't answered yet? This is where you can kind of plant the seeds for the rest of our conversation. Especially, I would love for you to get all your hard questions on the table for next Sunday so that Rich can answer those questions while I'm out of town. So just go ahead and you can text or email Rich all those questions this week. I'm sure he would absolutely love to have that. But he'll be teaching for me next week. But really, anything in here that you noticed in your pre-reading this week or in your reading so far that you liked or didn't like? Michael?
I like that I'm reminded that even though Peter stumbled, he speaks with authority here. He says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. You know, unfortunately for him, his failures are broadcast out there for us. And it helps me remember that, yes, I can fall flat on my face and get up and still serve the Lord.
Yeah. I mean, like, I know what my emotional state is when I make a small mistake or a big one. And if it's a small mistake, sometimes I'm bothered more than I should be, and it's a big mistake, I'm probably bothered less than I ought to be. That's my own personality. It's my own little struggles. Peter's value in the kingdom supersedes how we think about his failures. Because he's got all of them. I was talking to someone yesterday and the day before, and the way in which we perceive public personalities, be they politicians, actors, local government leaders, citizens across the board that are super well known. How do you respond when someone makes a video of all of their speaking mistakes? We laugh, right? Like, this guy's supposed to be, this woman's supposed to be, and look at all the dumb stuff they said. I am super thankful that it doesn't happen very much that people follow me around and point out all the dumb things that I say. I have family, so they do it for me, and so I know it happens. But if someone followed you around all day long and videotaped everything that you said, and then took that day's kind of statement and made a highlight reel of the day, how many of you would be really excited to watch that video? I kind of would laugh at myself for a little bit, but what if that was every day? Every day, somebody out there is making a video reel of all the dumb stuff that you said. We do that to people in public space all the time. We even laugh at their videos. We laugh at them or their ideas. And we do that some with Peter too. Because we denigrate Peter on the basis of his failure a little bit, when we need to remember that he did, in all of these instances, come round. When he was the denier, he came round to the confessor and preached on Pentecost. When he was a compromiser in Galatia, he came around and stayed united within the body of Christ and made the steps necessary to have that strong relationship. All of these things really are the successes that make him so valuable to us, and the kingdom message that we need to hear more and more. So my encouragement then is for us to think a little bit more clearly and concisely about Peter, but also make the application that he's probably, like all the rest of the apostles, closer to us than we sometimes give him space to be. Thanks, everybody. It's time for this morning.